The calm before the storm. Maya Williams had spent the last few months of her life in a whirlwind. Between juggling her demanding job as a graphic designer, keeping up with Elijah's school projects, and managing the daily chaos that life threw her way, she barely had a moment to breathe. But this trip, this vacation, was different. It was more than just a break from the routine. It was a symbol of hope, a chance for Maya to hit reset, to experience joy without the weight of deadlines pressing on her shoulders. She'd been working tirelessly for this moment, saving every spare penny, planning each detail meticulously. As she and her 7-year-old son, Elijah, made their way down the narrow aisle of the plane, she couldn't help but feel a wave of excitement. She'd planned this vacation as a way to reconnect with Elijah, to give him a break from school, and to show him the world beyond the concrete buildings and the busy streets they lived in. Maya's eyes sparkled with hope as they reached their seats. The airplane cabin was warm, filled with the soft chatter of passengers getting settled in, the faint scent of coffee and airplane food in the air. The hum of the engines was a constant, steady thrum that made her feel calm, a little less on edge. Elijah was a bundle of energy, bouncing up and down in his seat as he gripped the armrest tightly. His curly hair, usually a bit wild, was more so than usual, bouncing in time with the rhythm of his excitement. His eyes were wide with wonder as he peered out the window, pressing his face against the cool glass. The sight of the airplane wing stretching out into the blue sky mesmerized him, as if he were seeing magic unfold before his eyes. "Mom, look!" Elijah's voice broke through her thoughts, his face glowing with excitement. "We're flying. Look how high we are." Maya couldn't help but laugh, her heart swelling with love for this child who had already shown so much curiosity about the world. She reached over and gently patted his arm. "I see it, baby. It's amazing, isn't it?" Elijah's excitement was contagious. He was so full of life, his curiosity untainted by the world's complexities. In that moment, Maya felt the weight of the past few months lifting off her shoulders. She breathed in deeply, grateful for this precious time with her son. There was no agenda today, no meetings to attend, no deadlines to meet. Just pure, simple joy. They were going to the Caribbean, a place she had dreamed of visiting for years, a place where time seemed to slow down, where the ocean's waves and the warm sun could wash away all worries. Elijah continued his eager commentary, pointing out clouds and birds flying alongside the plane. Maya leaned back in her seat, allowing herself to relax as she listened to her son's voice. There were moments in life when everything aligned, when things felt right, and she knew this was one of those moments. The flight attendant walked down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. She was a woman in her late 20s, her neatly pinned hair giving off an air of professionalism, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Maya greeted her politely as the attendant passed their row, but Elijah's attention was fixed on the window once more. The airplane continued its climb, steadily rising above the city below, and Maya thought that perhaps she would never feel this peaceful again. This was what she had worked for, the ability to be present, to enjoy a moment without distractions. But just as Maya began to settle into that rare comfort of quiet, an unexpected sound sliced through the hum of the airplane. It was a small sound at first, barely noticeable amidst the murmurs and the rustle of in-flight magazines. But then, Elijah's voice broke through the ambient noise, his small feet kicking against the seat in front of him as he wiggled with excitement. "I'm so high up, Mom," Elijah said, practically bouncing in his seat. His feet were not kicking forcefully, just a gentle tap as he pressed his legs against the seat. Maya shot him a quick look, but it was a harmless action. She didn't think anything of it. A moment later, the flight attendant was back down the aisle. This time, she didn't pass by their row. Instead, she stopped in the middle of the aisle, her expression hardening as she turned to face them. Maya's heart skipped a beat. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, her lips curling slightly into a tight frown. "Excuse me, young man, but I asked you not to kick the seat," she said, her voice clipped and stern. Maya blinked, her thoughts momentarily scattered. "I'm sorry, he's just excited. It's his first time flying," she said gently, trying to defuse the situation. But the flight attendant didn't seem to care. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and leaned down to Elijah's level. "Excuses won't make this go away," she snapped, her tone rising. "You need to learn how to behave." Elijah's face fell. The excitement in his eyes dulled as he looked at his mother for reassurance, but Maya could feel the discomfort in the air growing thicker. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin once again, louder this time. "I said stop kicking," she commanded, her tone now an almost theatrical level of irritation, drawing the eyes of several passengers nearby. Maya could feel the heat rising in her chest, a growing discomfort as she tried to process the interaction. She had done everything right, she'd been polite, she'd apologized for her son's innocent excitement. But there was something about the flight attendant's attitude that rubbed her the wrong way. It felt like an overreaction, an unprovoked attack. Elijah was still too stunned to speak, his small hands now clutching the armrest, his gaze fixed on the floor as he sank into his seat. "I told you, Elijah, please stop," Maya said softly, not wanting to escalate things further. Her words, though gentle, were overshadowed by the coldness of the flight attendant's glare. The cabin had fallen silent, every eye now on their row, the awkward tension palpable. The flight attendant stood there for a few more seconds, her eyes still locked on Elijah as if daring him to defy her. Her posture was rigid, as though she were waiting for a response, but all Maya could do was sit there, a knot tightening in her stomach. Every moment stretched longer than it should have, the feeling of being unfairly judged creeping into her mind. Finally, with a flick of her wrist, the flight attendant straightened up, but not before delivering one final remark. "If you can't control your child, maybe flying isn't the place for you," she said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. The words hit Maya like a punch in the gut, and she could barely hide her shock. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend how a simple moment of excitement had turned into this cruel public scolding. The flight attendant turned to walk away, but not before giving Maya and Elijah one last, disdainful look. Maya swallowed hard, her eyes briefly meeting the gaze of a nearby passenger. No one had stepped in. No one had said a word. The weight of the silence was heavier than anything she had experienced before. Elijah, his voice small, looked up at her. "Mom, I didn't mean to make her mad. I was just excited." Maya's heart broke, but she managed to smile and pull him into a comforting hug. "It's not your fault, sweetie. You didn't do anything wrong." The calm of the flight had been shattered in an instant, and the journey that was supposed to be full of excitement now felt like a test Maya wasn't sure she was prepared for. A moment of unprovoked aggression. The air inside the plane, which had once felt warm and welcoming, now seemed stifling. Maya's breath caught in her chest as she looked down at Elijah, who was still gripping the armrest, his small body rigid with the weight of the moment. His big, brown eyes, normally filled with joy, were clouded with confusion, and Maya could see the faint tremor in his hands as he pulled them back into his lap. "Mom," Elijah whispered, his voice quivering, "did I do something wrong?" Maya's heart broke. She wanted to tell him it was all okay, that everything would be fine, but a sinking feeling in her stomach told her that this moment wasn't just going to pass. Not easily, anyway. She wanted to be strong for Elijah, to show him that no matter what, they would be all right, but it was hard to keep up the facade. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The flight attendant had walked away after delivering her cutting words, but the atmosphere had shifted. The once lively hum of the cabin had died down, replaced by a thick tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Passengers all around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. No one stepped in. Maya felt the isolation keenly, as though the entire cabin had turned into a silent, judgmental audience to her and her son's humiliation. "Sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong," Maya said, her voice more firmly now as she pulled Elijah closer. She kissed the top of his head, hoping it would provide some comfort. "She was just having a bad day. You were just being excited. You have every right to be excited. We're going on vacation." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes brimming with uncertainty. "But I didn't mean to make her upset. I just wanted to look out the window." Maya stroked his hair softly, willing herself to stay calm, though her own emotions were a swirl of frustration, disbelief, and anger. Elijah was so innocent. He didn't deserve to be treated like that. The flight attendant's words rang in her ears, over and over again, echoing in the space between them. "If you can't control your child, maybe flying isn't the place for you." Each word stung, cutting through Maya's resolve like a knife. She hadn't anticipated something like this. It had been just another day in what should have been a simple flight. And yet, the unexpected cruelty she'd just witnessed had taken all of her energy and shaken her to the core. It was as if her very right to be there had been called into question. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit back and let this woman continue to make Elijah feel small, as if he wasn't allowed to be a child on a plane. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't let her son's innocence be crushed by the judgment of a stranger. Just then, the same flight attendant returned, this time with a drink cart. She moved down the aisle, her eyes briefly flicking over to Maya and Elijah, but she did not acknowledge them. Maya could see the woman's expression had softened, but there was still an underlying coldness there, a kind of detachment that made her feel as if she were invisible. She watched the attendant interact with the other passengers, offering them drinks with a polite smile, but that same unpleasant energy hung over their row. The moment felt unbearable. The long minutes that stretched between the interactions seemed to crawl by, leaving Maya's nerves on edge. She kept her eyes on Elijah, watching him closely, as though trying to gauge his feelings, trying to make sure that this wasn't going to scar him in a way that would be harder to fix. She needed him to know that people like that flight attendant weren't the norm. They shouldn't be. But despite Maya's efforts to keep the mood light, Elijah couldn't shake the unease that settled in his small chest. He turned to her again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, can we leave this plane?" Maya's heart clenched at the simple question. "We can't, sweetie. We're already up in the air, and we'll be landing soon. But we're okay. I promise you we're okay. It's just one person who was mean, but she doesn't define what this trip is going to be about." Elijah nodded slowly, but Maya could tell he wasn't fully convinced. The last thing she wanted was for him to feel unsafe, or for him to internalize the experience and think that this was how the world worked. She wanted to shield him from it, to tell him that there was good in the world, and that kindness would always outweigh cruelty. But how could she explain that when she herself was still processing the hurt she felt? The flight attendant was now standing at the front of the cabin, chatting with another member of the crew. Maya tried not to stare but couldn't help it, she had to watch. She wasn't sure what had driven the woman to speak to them the way she had, but she couldn't let it go. She had a sinking suspicion that it wasn't just a case of a bad day, that there was more to it than that. The flight attendant's behavior hadn't felt like an isolated incident. There had been something about the way she spoke to Elijah, something that felt personal, too personal. Maya's thoughts were interrupted as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their altitude and expected flight time. His voice was calm and steady, but Maya barely registered it. Her mind was still on the flight attendant, on the humiliation, on Elijah. "Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position as we continue our climb," the captain's voice rang out, but his words were drowned out by the rush of adrenaline in Maya's chest. She knew she couldn't let the situation fester. She needed to find a way to address it, not just for her sake, but for Elijah's. He needed to know that standing up for yourself and standing up for others was important, even if it was uncomfortable. Especially if it was uncomfortable. Maya glanced around the cabin, looking for someone, anyone, who might step in, who might offer even a word of support. But no one did. It was as though the whole cabin had fallen under some strange, collective spell of silence. The passengers kept their eyes down, avoiding confrontation, and Maya felt the loneliness of the moment wash over her. She couldn't understand it. How could they all just sit there, letting an innocent child be reprimanded like that? Could no one see the injustice? She turned back to Elijah, who had gone quiet again, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Maya squeezed his hand, her voice firm but filled with warmth. "We're going to be all right, Elijah. We're going to have fun. And we won't let anyone stop us from enjoying our time here. Not now, not ever." Elijah's eyes brightened a little, but Maya could see the lingering uncertainty in them. She knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, not for either of them. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this moment wasn't just about a flight or a rude flight attendant. This was about something much bigger, a lesson that needed to be learned. Not just by Elijah, but by everyone. Just as she was about to continue reassuring him, there was a slight disturbance at the front of the cabin. Maya turned instinctively, her heart racing. The flight attendant who had scolded them earlier was talking to another member of the crew. Her body language had changed, the tightness in her shoulders now more pronounced. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and Maya could feel it in her bones. This wasn't going to be over any time soon. She glanced down at Elijah again, his eyes now focused on the situation at the front of the plane. "Stay close to me, okay?" Maya whispered. Elijah nodded, clutching her hand tightly as they braced for whatever was coming next. A confrontation. The minutes dragged on, each one longer than the last. Maya couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her, even though most of the passengers had returned to their own little worlds, pretending not to notice the unsettling scene unfolding in the row ahead. She could hear the occasional murmurs of passengers in hushed conversations, but no one dared to speak out. She felt the weight of the silence pressing against her chest, suffocating her. At the front of the plane, the flight attendant was still talking to the other crew member. Maya couldn't make out the words, but the exchange was heated. The flight attendant's gestures were sharp, and her body language spoke volumes. She was clearly upset, though it wasn't clear if it was from guilt or frustration. Maya watched the scene unfold with bated breath, her senses on high alert, sensing that something was about to shift. The flight attendant had been rude to Elijah. She had humiliated him, and no one, not even the crew, had said anything. But now, Maya could see the signs of conflict in the air. Something was coming, and it wasn't just going to fade away. Elijah, too, seemed attuned to the growing tension. His small hands were still clutched tightly in her own, and his body had gone rigid again, as if bracing for something worse. Maya gently pulled him closer, whispering words of reassurance into his ear, but her thoughts were racing. Her instincts told her that she couldn't let this moment pass without taking action. She couldn't let her son grow up thinking that people could just treat others poorly without consequence. No, this was a moment to teach him how to stand up for himself, and for others. As the minutes ticked by, Maya tried to steady her breathing. She had been on flights before, long ones, short ones, delayed ones, and it had always been a smooth experience. Never had she imagined that something so trivial as a child's excitement could trigger such hostility. But now, as she sat there, the anger bubbled up inside her like a storm, and she knew she could not simply let it go. Elijah's innocent joy had been crushed by a stranger's cruelty. And something inside her snapped. She turned toward the aisle, her eyes locking onto the flight attendant, who was now walking back toward the cockpit. The other crew member had left the scene, but the tension between them had clearly not been resolved. Maya could see it in the flight attendant's rigid posture and her quick, clipped movements. She was trying to compose herself, but it was clear that Maya was no longer invisible to her. "Excuse me," Maya called out firmly, her voice rising slightly above the noise of the plane's hum. The flight attendant stiffened, her eyes darting toward Maya's row, her expression guarded but wary. She clearly didn't expect the confrontation. Maya took a deep breath, her words carefully chosen. "I need to speak with you." The flight attendant paused, glancing at her and then at Elijah, who had once again curled up in his seat, his gaze averted. She gave a quick, sharp nod but didn't immediately approach. Instead, she took a few more steps toward the front of the plane, as though weighing her options. Maya's patience was wearing thin, and she could feel the heat of frustration rising within her. She couldn't let this moment pass. If no one else was going to say anything, she would. "I'm sorry, but I'm not letting this go," Maya called after her, her voice gaining strength. The flight attendant turned slowly, and for the first time, their eyes met. Maya didn't look away. The flight attendant sighed, her jaw tightening as though preparing herself for a confrontation. "Is there something else I can help you with?" she asked in a tone that was thinly veiled with condescension, as if expecting Maya to back down. She could see the flight attendant was already mentally bracing for the annoyance she assumed was coming her way. Maya shook her head, holding up her hand slightly in a gesture to halt her. "It's not about needing your help. It's about how you treated my son just now." The words were calm, but the underlying steel in her voice was undeniable. She was no longer just defending Elijah. She was standing up for what was right. The flight attendant's face flushed, her eyes narrowing. "He was kicking the seat," she responded curtly, her tone defensive. Maya's eyes flashed with disbelief. "Excuse me?" He was excited. This was his first time flying. He was tapping his feet, not kicking the seat. "You humiliated him in front of everyone. You could have handled it differently." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her hands stiff by her sides. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, clearly dismissing the situation, but the fire in Maya's chest was still burning hot. "Don't you dare dismiss me," Maya replied, her voice now rising. "You owe my son an apology. You don't get to treat people like that. You don't get to talk down to him just because he's excited to be on an airplane. This is about more than a seat kick, it's about respect. And you showed none." The flight attendant's face turned red, a mixture of anger and humiliation creeping across her features. She opened her mouth, as though to respond, but just then, another voice interrupted. "Everything okay back here?" A male flight attendant had appeared, his expression serious but not entirely unfriendly. His uniform was crisp, and he exuded a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. Maya turned to face him, her voice unwavering. "No, it's not okay. This woman just berated my son for doing nothing but tapping his feet because he was excited. And instead of being understanding, she made him feel like he was doing something wrong. I want to know why." The male flight attendant took a step closer, his eyes flicking briefly to the flight attendant who had caused the scene. He seemed to take in the situation with a level of professionalism that Maya had hoped would be there from the beginning. He glanced back at her, then back at the flight attendant, his tone measured. "I'm going to ask you to come with me, please. Let's sort this out in private." The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, stiffened, but she said nothing. Instead, she shot Maya a resentful glance and turned, heading down the aisle toward the galley area where the rest of the crew was stationed. Maya held her ground, watching her every move. She wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Not when it meant teaching Elijah how to stand up for himself, how to confront unfairness head-on. Maya sat back down, her muscles tense, her hand still resting gently on Elijah's. He hadn't said a word since the confrontation, but Maya could see his eyes shifting from her to the front of the plane, where the flight attendant had disappeared. He was still absorbing everything that had happened. "Sweetheart," Maya said softly, her voice low but steady, "don't ever let anyone make you feel less than. You have the right to be yourself. You have the right to be excited. You have the right to be a child, no matter what anyone else says. Do you understand? Elijah's eyes, full of wonder and innocence, met hers. For the first time since the confrontation began, he nodded. I understand, Mom. Maya smiled at him, but the resolve in her heart hadn't shifted. She knew this wasn't over. But no matter what came next, she would make sure that Elijah, her bright, curious, and kind son, would always remember that standing up for yourself, for what's right, was the most important thing of all. The aftermath. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as Maya sat back in her seat, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. The flight attendant had disappeared toward the rear of the plane, leaving an unsettling silence in her wake. The passengers around them continued to glance nervously at one another, avoiding eye contact with Maya and Elijah, their faces painted with a mixture of discomfort and reluctance. It was as if they were all silently agreeing not to intervene, perhaps out of fear or uncertainty, but it stung all the same. Maya could feel the weight of their judgment, the uncomfortable quiet that had settled into the cabin like a thick fog. But she didn't let it deter her. She wasn't here to please anyone. She was here for Elijah. She was here to teach him the value of standing up for what was right, no matter how uncomfortable it might get. Elijah, still holding her hand, was now looking up at her, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. He didn't understand all the details of the confrontation, but he could feel the shift in the energy around them. He could feel the weight of it too, though in a different way. Are we going to be okay, Mom? Elijah asked, his voice small, yet full of hope. Maya's heart broke a little at his question. She wished she could say everything would be fine and that the flight would continue smoothly without any further disruptions. But she knew better than that. The situation was far from over. The flight attendant hadn't just apologized and moved on. This wasn't about an isolated incident anymore. This was about the deeper question of what had just unfolded, the unjust treatment, the silence from others, the subtle, systemic issues at play. We're going to be more than okay, Maya said, trying to sound confident, though she wasn't sure of that herself. You did nothing wrong. And I'm proud of you for staying calm. But more importantly, you stood up for yourself without even realizing it. Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes still a little unsure. Maya squeezed his hand tighter, trying to reassure him with her warmth and her strength, though inside, she felt anything but. She knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than an isolated incident. The flight was no longer just about a trip, it was about standing up to inequality, about confronting prejudice and misunderstanding head-on, even in the smallest moments. As the minutes passed, Maya's mind raced. She couldn't just sit idly by and let things settle down, not without knowing what would come next. The flight attendant needed to be held accountable. She needed to understand that her behavior was not acceptable, not only to Elijah but to anyone who had been affected by her actions, whether or not they had spoken up. Maya knew that confronting her had been the right thing to do, but the process couldn't stop there. Just as she was about to lean back and close her eyes, hoping for a moment of calm, a soft knock came from the side of her seat. Startled, Maya turned to find the male flight attendant, the one who had intervened earlier, standing in the aisle, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Ma'am, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his tone respectful but serious. Maya nodded, gesturing for him to sit. She could sense the gravity of the moment. He wasn't just coming over for a casual chat. Something had happened behind the scenes, and it was time for her to find out exactly what. The flight attendant sat down across from her, his eyes briefly scanning Elijah, who was still curled up in his seat, playing with the fabric of his jeans. He seemed a little calmer now, but Maya could tell he was still trying to process everything. "I want to apologize for what happened earlier," the male flight attendant began, his voice sincere. "That was not appropriate behavior, and I understand how upsetting it must have been for both of you. I've already spoken with the lead crew member, and we've pulled the flight attendant aside. Maya leaned forward slightly, her attention fully on him. And what happens now? She asked, her voice steady but with an underlying edge. Will there be any consequences for her actions? The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I've reported it to the cabin manager, and she's already been escorted to the back of the plane. We're having a conversation about what happened. I want you to know that we take this seriously. This kind of behavior has no place in this airline, and we are addressing it. Maya's jaw clenched, but she nodded slowly. Good. Because it wasn't just rude, it was unprofessional. It's not just about Elijah's excitement either. She treated him like he was a problem, like he didn't have a right to be there. She belittled him in front of everyone, and that kind of attitude isn't something I'm going to let slide. The flight attendant seemed to take a deep breath, as though he were mentally bracing himself for what was to come next. We understand, ma'am. We're doing everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll be speaking with her directly, and I assure you that the situation is being handled appropriately. Maya appreciated the sincerity in his voice, but she wasn't sure that words alone would be enough. She had seen the way the flight attendant had acted. It wasn't just a bad day. It was a reflection of something much deeper. And now, Maya couldn't just rely on the promise of a conversation. She needed to see real change, real consequences. You understand why this is important, right? Maya continued, her voice firm but calm. This isn't just about one incident. It's about teaching our children that their voices matter, that their excitement isn't something to be stifled by the prejudices of others. It's about making sure that kids, like my son, know that they are safe in the world, safe from being judged or belittled for just being themselves. The flight attendant nodded solemnly, his eyes sincere. I understand. I promise you will make this right. For a moment, Maya simply stared at him, letting the silence settle between them. It wasn't that she expected the world to change overnight. It wasn't even that she thought one conversation would erase the hurt that had been done. But it was a step forward. It was something. As she sat there, feeling the vibration of the plane as it leveled out, Maya couldn't help but feel a little lighter. The situation was far from perfect, but she had made her stand, and so had Elijah in his own way. She had raised her voice, and in doing so, had taught him an invaluable lesson in how to confront injustice. How to speak out, even when it feels uncomfortable. How to remain steadfast in the face of adversity. As the minutes passed, the plane continued its flight, cruising smoothly through the clouds. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, giving a routine update about their progress. Maya listened to it absently, her mind still focused on Elijah. She glanced over at him, noticing that he had fallen into a more peaceful sleep, his body relaxed against the seat. He was still holding onto her hand, but his breathing had slowed, his small chest rising and falling in the quiet rhythm of sleep. For the first time in what felt like hours, Maya allowed herself to breathe deeply and let go of the tension that had built up in her chest. In that moment, as she watched her son, Maya realized that no matter what happened next, they would be okay. She had stood up for him. She had taught him what it meant to defend your dignity, to fight for kindness, and to stand up for what was right. They would carry that lesson with them long after the flight had ended. But as the plane continued its journey through the skies, Maya knew this story was far from finished. The events of the day had set something in motion, something that was about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The question now was not if there would be consequences, but how far the ripples of this moment would reach. And that was something that would soon become all too clear. Unforeseen consequences. The plane flew on through the skies, its engines humming steadily beneath them, but Maya couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. The confrontation with the flight attendant had been necessary, yes, but now the questions started to pile up in her mind. What would happen to her? What consequences would she face, if any? And was this going to be one of those moments that faded away as the turbulence of the situation passed, or would there be more, a ripple effect that might spread far beyond this flight? She glanced at Elijah, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the weight of the battle she had just waged. His small face was serene, his lips parted slightly as he dreamed his childlike dreams, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded mere moments ago. In that moment, Maya realized how important this was, not just for Elijah, but for everyone who had witnessed the incident. She leaned back in her seat, trying to relax, but her mind kept racing. She couldn't help but replay the scene in her head, every word, every glance. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that what had happened wasn't just about a single flight attendant being rude. It was about something much deeper, something ingrained in society. The way people like her son, like them, were often overlooked or underestimated. The way society often saw people of color as lesser, as deserving of less respect, as if their dignity could be stripped away with a simple glance or a harsh word. No, she wouldn't let it slide. Not this time. As the plane cruised on, Maya decided she would keep pushing. She wouldn't allow this incident to be swept under the rug. She couldn't. Not after everything Elijah had endured, not after everything they had both gone through. She had to make sure that this moment would have real consequences for the flight attendant. She didn't want vengeance, but she wanted accountability, genuine accountability. The sound of the intercom crackling broke her train of thought, and Maya looked up just in time to see the flight attendant, the one who had been at the center of the altercation, return to the aisle, escorted by 2 other crew members. Her uniform was neat, but her eyes were downcast, a look of humiliation on her face. She passed by Maya's row without even acknowledging them, her shoulders hunched as though she were trying to make herself as small as possible. Maya's chest tightened at the sight. She had expected something like this. She had hoped for a swift resolution, but now, seeing the flight attendant in this state, she couldn't help but wonder how much of this was genuine remorse, and how much was merely a consequence of getting caught. The male flight attendant who had initially intervened came by again shortly after, his demeanor no longer quite as calm as before. His eyes met Maya's, and he stopped just a few feet away from her seat. He looked tense, his jaw set firmly. It was clear that something had happened behind the scenes, and whatever it was had put the entire crew on edge. "Ma'am," he said quietly, glancing at Elijah before looking back at her. "I want to thank you for your patience. I'm afraid there's been some additional developments. We've taken the situation to higher management, and there's a process in place that's already underway. I can't go into specifics, but I assure you, action is being taken." Maya felt a small flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the question still gnawing at her. "Action?" she echoed, her voice low but firm. "What kind of action? Is she being reprimanded, suspended, or what?" The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "She's been removed from duty for the remainder of the flight. I don't know what decisions will be made after that, but she is no longer a part of this crew. That's all I can say right now." Maya nodded slowly, digesting the information. She hadn't expected an immediate solution, but this was a step, one that she would take note of. At least she wouldn't have to endure the same treatment for the rest of the flight, but she still wanted to make sure this didn't end here. She didn't want this flight attendant's behavior to just be brushed off, to become a mere footnote in the history of her airline's customer service. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice steady but laced with determination. "I appreciate your efforts in handling this. But I need to be clear about something. This isn't just about her being removed from duty. It's about ensuring that this kind of behavior isn't allowed to continue anywhere, whether it's in the sky or on the ground. I'm sure you understand." The flight attendant nodded, his expression serious. "I do, ma'am. I do." He seemed to study her for a moment before adding, "And I'll make sure that's passed along. I can't promise you anything, but I'll make sure the right people know how serious this is." Maya offered him a small, appreciative smile, though inside, her resolve was hardening. She knew that she had just taken a stand for something larger than herself, something that would impact not only her family but possibly others as well. She didn't know where this would lead, but she was prepared to see it through. The flight continued in a strange, muted quiet. Passengers were now more aware of the situation, some glancing over at Maya and Elijah with expressions that seemed a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. Others had returned to their own business, pretending not to notice what had transpired. Maya tried to ignore their stares, but it was difficult. This wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It had become a public statement, an unsaid acknowledgement that things needed to change. When the plane began its descent toward their destination, the world outside the window grew clearer, the Earth's surface coming into view below. Maya could feel the pull of gravity shifting, the familiar dip and rise of the plane as it readied itself to land. It was a comforting sensation, like the final part of a long journey that was almost complete. But as the wheels touched down and the plane slowed to a halt on the tarmac, the lingering questions remained. What would happen when they disembarked? What would the fallout be when they reached the gate? Maya could feel the weight of it all pressing on her once more. As the fasten seatbelt sign flickered off and passengers began to gather their things, she tightened her grip on Elijah's hand. "Ready to get off this plane, buddy?" she asked, trying to sound light-hearted, though there was still an undertone of seriousness in her voice. Elijah nodded, a small smile creeping across his face. "I am. I want to go to the hotel and swim in the pool." Maya chuckled softly, the sound of his excitement pulling her momentarily from the heaviness of the situation. "Sounds like a great plan. We've earned it." As the cabin doors opened and passengers began to disembark, Maya and Elijah made their way toward the gate, her mind still racing. They were leaving the plane, but this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. The flight attendant, whose behavior had sparked everything, had already been escorted off the aircraft, but Maya wasn't about to let it rest here. She would make sure the airline heard her voice. She would take the next steps, whatever they may be, because this incident couldn't just fade into the background. Elijah's dignity, their dignity, was worth fighting for. And as she and Elijah walked down the jetway, Maya felt an unwavering sense of pride. No matter what came next, she had done the right thing. She had stood her ground. And she wasn't about to let that be forgotten. The ripple effect. Maya and Elijah stepped off the plane into the busy airport terminal, the noise of 1,000 voices swirling around them. But for Maya, everything felt oddly distant, as if she were walking through a fog. The hum of voices and the shuffle of feet around them blurred as she processed the weight of what had just happened. It was over. Or so she thought. As they made their way through the terminal toward baggage claim, Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a routine message or perhaps an update from the hotel. But the notification on her screen stopped her in her tracks. It was an email, one from the airline's customer service department. She unlocked her phone and opened it. The message was short, but the words struck a chord in her. "Dear Ms. Carter. We regret the distress you experienced on Flight 308 today. We take full responsibility for the actions of our crew member, and after thorough investigation, we have decided to take immediate and appropriate action. We understand that words cannot undo the harm caused, but we want to assure you that we are taking steps to ensure this does not happen again. We sincerely hope that you will continue to trust us for your future travel. Warm regards. Customer Care Team." Airline name. Maya stood frozen in place, reading the email over and over, her eyes scanning for any hint of real accountability. While the apology was there, something about the generic wording left a sour taste in her mouth. The email didn't feel like a sincere acknowledgement of the impact of the flight attendant's actions. Instead, it seemed like an attempt to close the matter quickly and move on. She exhaled slowly, her disappointment palpable. But she wasn't one to back down, especially now that she had come so far. Her anger, which had simmered under the surface, began to bubble up again. She had expected more, a genuine apology, perhaps even some indication of what appropriate action had been taken. Instead, they had offered a surface-level message meant to appease her, and it was clear they hadn't fully grasped the significance of the incident. "Mom?" Elijah's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She looked down to see him staring up at her with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her. "Are we going to go get the luggage now?" Maya forced a smile, tucking the phone back into her pocket. "Yeah, buddy. We'll go get it. But there's something I need to do first." Elijah frowned slightly, sensing the shift in his mother's mood, but he nodded. "Okay, Mom." As they continued to walk through the terminal, Maya's mind was already racing with the next step. She couldn't just let the airline's weak apology be the end of it. She would take the next step, she had to. It wasn't just about her and Elijah. It wasn't just about the flight attendant or the brief confrontation. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected because of their skin color or background. Maya wasn't going to let that go. Not when she had the chance to make a difference. The baggage claim area was crowded, passengers jockeying for space as they waited for their luggage. Maya had almost forgotten how much time had passed since they landed, lost in her thoughts. She checked the board to see which carousel their bags would arrive on. Elijah, meanwhile, ran ahead, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could manage. He was distracted by the lights, the noise, the swirl of people around him. Maya's phone buzzed again. This time, the notification was from a social media platform. She glanced down to see that it was a message, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw who it was from. It was an acquaintance of hers from her professional network, a woman named Carla who had worked in corporate public relations for several years. Carla was someone Maya occasionally shared industry updates with, but they weren't close friends. However, Carla's message wasn't about work. It was about the flight incident. The exact incident. Maya's stomach tightened. It was clear the word had spread. The message read, "Hey Maya. I saw what happened on the flight you were on today. A friend of mine was sitting near you, and she mentioned it on social media. I just wanted to say how proud I am of you for standing up for your son in that moment. You're inspiring others by taking a stand. I hope you don't mind, but I shared the story on my feed too. This is a conversation that needs to be had. People need to hear what happened. If you need help getting the word out, let me know. We need to keep pushing for change. Carla." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the story to go public, at least not like this. And yet, as she read Carla's message again, a spark of something ignited inside her. She had been expecting to fight this battle alone, but maybe, just maybe, this could be bigger than one woman's voice. Without hesitation, she typed a response. "Thank you, Carla. I appreciate it. I didn't expect this to spread, but now that it has, maybe this is the moment for something bigger. Let's talk soon." As she hit send, her mind spun with possibilities. She could take this further, turn this isolated incident into a movement, perhaps. If others were paying attention, if they were willing to listen, this could be the chance to make real, lasting change. A few minutes later, as they waited for their luggage, a group of passengers from the flight, some of whom Maya didn't recognize, approached her. She was still processing Carla's message, but as they stepped closer, she straightened up. These weren't just casual travelers, their eyes were filled with purpose. "We saw what happened on the flight," a woman said, her voice soft but firm. "We were sitting a few rows behind you. I just wanted to say, thank you. You did what a lot of people would have been too afraid to do." Maya blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to come forward in person. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little hoarse. "I wasn't sure anyone else saw it, but I couldn't just let it go. It wasn't right." The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile. "No, it wasn't. And it's not just about that one flight attendant. It's about how people like you and your son are treated every day. We need more people to stand up, to call out that kind of behavior. I think you've sparked something here." Maya's chest tightened again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the bitterness of anger, but the weight of responsibility. She had started something, whether she intended to or not. Something was shifting, something was growing, and there was no turning back now. "I don't know what will happen next," Maya said, her voice steady. "But I know I'm not going to let this go. I'm not going to let my son or anyone else be treated that way without consequences." The woman nodded. "I believe you. And I'll be here to support you however I can." And just like that, Maya realized that she wasn't alone. The community around her was growing, one voice at a time, one person who had been affected by the injustice, one person who was ready to stand up and demand change. When they finally retrieved their bags and walked toward the exit, Maya felt an undeniable shift in the air around her. The simple act of standing up for her son had created a ripple that was quickly expanding beyond her immediate surroundings. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain: the story was far from over. As they stepped into the cool night air, ready for the vacation they had worked so hard to plan, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising in her chest. The fight for justice had only just begun. And together, they would make sure their voices were heard.